I remember kind of just being confused by it, especially as a younger guy, like I was in my early 20s at the time, like why is this happening? And I took a deeper look at some of the data. And so I wanted to see if this was true. Like, are men the problem? Are men really kind of dominating a bunch of groups of minorities and women and things like that in a way that's not good? And what I found, ironically, was in a lot of ways, in most ways, it was not true at all. And in reality, men were struggling quite immensely. What I saw was that in almost every fundamental area of a human flourishing life, men were falling off a cliff. In higher education, in suicide rates, in drug addiction, in pornography consumption, in social media addiction, who goes into cults more, who's on the street more, who dies 5 years on average earlier. And I said, like, whoa, like red blinking light, like, what is this? Like, what's going on here?
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
All right, welcome. I'm here today with Sam Lacrosse. He is an author, podcaster, blogger, and business owner, which is quite a resume. He had me on his show, and I really enjoyed our conversation, so I thought I'd invite him on my show. Sam, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, thanks, Ryan. I really appreciate, guesting on other people's shows. It's a really big honor for me, especially because you could be interviewing a lot of people about a lot of different things with your impressive resume as well. So I appreciate you having me on your show. So yeah, man, just a little bit about me. So from Cleveland, Ohio, originally grew up a little bit outside the city, about 20 minutes, born and bred, raised there up until I was 18. Pretty nucleic family structure, not just in the home that I was raised in, two parents, two siblings. I'm the oldest of three, a younger sister, younger brother, a dog most of the time, and then also had a lot of grandparents around me, a lot of aunts, uncles, people like that were really, very close to my life, very closely knitted family structure. Then went to Columbus for college. I went to the Ohio State University, did business there, and nearly failed out a couple times. Started an online writing business and kind of, a media company that I had with starting my first blog, or I would say my original blog, my only blog that I've had, don'treadthisblog.com, until I turned it into the Value Economics Substack that I now have. And so did that in my 4 years up until May of 2020 when I graduated. And so obviously March of 2020, the COVID pandemic hits and shuts down the world and throws my graduation all off kilter and everything like that. So that was kind of a bizarre time to be in the college scene. Generally, there was a lot of stuff I experienced there, a lot of stuff going on. And then I moved out to Boston. I got an entry-level job in technology sales out there for a really large tech firm across the world. And so did pretty well for myself, and then took a promotion out to Austin, Texas. I'd wanted to live in Texas since I was in high school. I love the kind of, I'm a romantic at heart. I'm a writer, so I'm very much like a go west young man sort of thing, where I went out and kind of did the whole thing where I wanted to establish myself out here. Landed out in Austin, and I never want to leave. I've been here for almost 4 years, about a little over 3.5 years now, and I love it. And I love being here. I love the church that I'm at. I work in 3 ministries over there. I basically took a job out in tech sales out here as a promotion. I was an account executive for about 3 years. I would say I did that for about 3 years, and then used that to start both of my companies that I now run. I run an alternative education business, and I run a business accelerator, as well as my media organization that I have, which is basically an umbrella company for my podcast, which is almost 300 episodes. I have 200 plus articles, newsletters, all the way out on my Substack that I have. And I've written 2 books, and I have a third one coming out next year, as well as kind of kicking around a novel and the 4th book that I'm working on right now. The first one, Value Economics, was the kind of one that started it all. It's now become my umbrella brand for basically all of my companies, all my books, all my media, all gets funneled through that. That was published in 2022. And I published my second book, Toxic Immaturity, which is around the problems of men and masculinity in the modern culture today. That came out in December of 2023. So over a year ago now today, which is crazy. And then obviously, like I said, the third book coming out next year. And so I love talking about culture. I think culture is kind of my main fascination point, about kind of values, culture, how those two intersect, and how things are going wrong in a lot of different ways, not only politically, not only culturally, but kind of with families and spirituality and religion and things like that. I love talking about just the overall issues on a grand and deep scale. And so kind of avoiding more of the surface level issues and going to really where the root of these come from, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to get into talking about your businesses in a second, but I want to talk about these books, because it seemed like you put a lot of thought into the books and fleshed out a lot of ideas. What was the first one? Was it Toxic Immaturity?
Value Economics was the first one.
Okay.
So Value Economics came out, I would love to. And so the first book in Value Economics, that essentially came out of some of my original blog posts that I made, it was funny, I was actually recording a YouTube video on this yesterday for my channel, and I kind of recounted the story for the first time in quite a while, so it's fresh on my mind. And I remember I started a blog in October of 2019. I bought a WordPress website for $160, cybersecurity, restrictions or anything. So I had Chinese shampoo manufacturers spamming my comments and everything all the time. It was great. I loved it, but it was kind of, that was kind of the vibe of the whole thing. But yeah, I remember I started a blog in late 2019 because I was a big fan of Mark Manson at the time. Mark was really my main author inspiration at that point to become an author. I was always a writer. I wrote competitively as a child. I was really involved in a lot of advanced literature classes in high school and loved to write for fun. I, like I said, wrote competitively, all those things. Took a creative writing class for fun in college. And I wanted to do that on a grander scale because of what Mark did. And unfortunately for me, and I would learn this too late, I missed the blogging days by about 10 years where people made actually money off of blogs, and I was able to do a career off of blogs. I thought I was going to be able to write everywhere and get paid for my writing. That did not happen at all. But it just kind of got an outlet for my ideas and for things that I wanted to do because I knew I wanted to do something with it, so I just started small with a WordPress site. And then after my I have a blog post, everyone come look at me, I didn't really know where to go after that. And I remember I was a finance major in college, and to graduate, we had to take a advanced economics class in college, either micro or macroeconomics class in college. And I remember I was thinking earlier that summer in 2019, I was interning at a private bank at that time, and I was thinking about uploading a video on Facebook. This is how outdated and how out of the way I was, about kind of like, what can I do? I was thinking about the ideas of value and sacrifice, about like the more you value something, the more you can sacrifice to get that something, and the inverse was true. And I was thinking of doing maybe like a 6-minute video and tossing that on Facebook and seeing what people thought of it. And I said, okay, that sounds interesting. What can I do with this? And then we were inside of this classroom. It was a really, really big lecture hall. I went to the third biggest public university in the country, so it was a huge group, a huge number of students. And I was in the back with some guys that I knew. I think 1 or 2 guys from my high school, and then a couple guys that they knew. And we were kind of joshing around the back of the class. It wasn't really a serious cohort of people, myself included, I should say. And I remember the professor went back. He was a very funny guy. I really liked him. Kind of, older gentleman. John was one of my very few supporters at the time. She was a lovely friend of mine. And I texted her and I asked her, hey, did you read the post? And she said yes. And I asked her what she thought, and she said, it makes sense to me. And I said, well, that's kind of weird. How did it make sense to you? And she said, well, I want to be in good shape, so I sacrifice an hour of my time to go to the gym and run for an hour on the treadmill. And I said, holy shit, for lack of a better term. Like that, like someone actually understands what I'm trying to say. Like I'm not nuts. I'm not like shouting into the void over here. And so a lot of people said, or I shouldn't say a lot of people, but some people, enough people gave me validation to say, okay, I'm not crazy. And so I then titled it Value Economics Chapter 1, The Value Sacrifice Trade-Off. That was the original post on my blog over 5 years ago now, almost 6 years ago now. And then I said, okay, the next month, what if I did Chapter 2? And I did write Chapter 2. And then that turned into Chapter 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, takes me into the summer of 2020, when I was on FaceTime with my parents, and I told them, guys, that I really think I have something here. And I really think that I can flesh this out and make something out of this. And my parents have always been incredibly supportive of me, and they said, yeah, go ahead and see what you can make of it. And I remember I went and read David Goggins' book, Can't Hurt Me. And so I thought it was a great book, like a lot of people did. I really, really love Goggins. I love a lot of what he says and everything like that. And I got to the back of the book, and I said, my overwhelming feeling, I don't know if you've read Can't Hurt Me before, Ryan, but I think that, it's a very profane book. He swears a lot. Like there's a lot of politically incorrect things inside of the book. And my one thought, and you probably have experienced this as well, like, who in the world would take a risk on publishing something like this and defame their reputation and things like that? Because this is publishing houses are very big, old, kind of archaic institutions. And here comes this Navy SEAL guy with a sailor mouth and talking about all this stuff here. And I remember I looked at the back of the book, and he said, he didn't name Simon & Schuster, he didn't name Penguin Random House or HarperCollins or any of the big publishing houses. He named a small company called Scribe Media. And I remember I Googled them immediately and saw that they were giving opportunities, if I were to pay them, to publish books for authors that were either on the come up or didn't want to go the traditional publishing route. So I went and I called the guy over there who's doing the consults, Miles Road, who's a friend of mine to this day. And I went and I pitched him the book, and he loved it, and he offered to publish the book on the spot. And that was in November of 2021. And then that came out about 8 months later on June 28th of 2022. And it did really well. It hit 2 #1 spots on the Amazon bestseller list. It helped a lot of people. It spun off into my companies. And then at the same time, as I was publishing that book, I was thinking about really the problems arising around men in our culture. I felt like, and this was at the height of, I think, of the post Me Too fallout, like the toxic masculinity prime argument that was kind of raging in the culture now. And I remember kind of just being confused by it, especially as a younger guy, like I was in my early 20s at the time, like, why is this happening? And I took a deeper look at some of the data about, like, okay, because my default posture when someone makes a claim about anything is to say, okay, is this true or not true, and why? And so I wanted to see if this was true. Like, are men the problem? Are men really kind of dominating a bunch of groups of minorities and women and things like that in a way that's not good? And what I found, ironically, was in a lot of ways, in most ways, it was not true at all. And in reality, men were struggling quite immensely. And what I noticed about those struggles is that it wasn't just that, like, the marginal tax rate was being applied to men at like 5% and women at 6%. Like, that wasn't a struggle that I was kind of talking about with that. What I saw was that in almost every fundamental area of a human flourishing life, men were falling off a cliff. In higher education, in suicide rates, in drug addiction, in pornography consumption, in social media addiction, who goes into cults more, who's on the street more, who dies 5 years on average earlier. And I said, oh, like, whoa, like red blinking light, like, what is this? Like, what's going on here? And then I kind of went into the whole delve of that world, and I kind of built a book based off of the overall value structure of what men are struggling with now. So the first one, to give prior context, was based on individual identity. And I wanted to use values at the individual level because, Ryan, we talked about this in our conversation we had. I believe identity is the primary problem and issue of our time right now. Like, who am I? What should I do? How should I act? Who should I associate with? Why should I do the things that I do? And I think you would agree with this as well, we have a lot of bad answers to that question right now in terms of, I want to be identified primarily by a racial group or a gender or a sexual orientation or a political affiliation or whatever. Instead of examining Ryan Rogers or Sam Lacrosse as the person, we kind of pick apart the very superficial parts of it that don't mean anything at all and organize by those groups and tribalize based on those groups together. And I think that's been catastrophic. And so what I wanted to do with value economics is to put together an individualized narrative, kind of a new set of individualism based on individual values, about using that to craft your identity and then go in the world and make something of yourself and be a better person. So it was more of a philosophy and a self-help book. With toxic maturity, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, that's really interesting, and I feel like this is true for everyone, but, you know, specifically talking about men, a lot of times it feels like we were dropped on this earth with no instruction manual. And you kind of have this one side of things with radical feminism that says, you know, you are the problem, like your essence, your masculinity is toxic in and of itself. You need to essentially be subservient. And it's kind of an emasculated vision of masculinity. And then on the other side, you've got this red pill kind of philosophy where it's like, no, you're really the victim. You need to go out and conquer and take over what's rightfully yours. So it's kind of like, it's hard to expect men, I think, in some sense, to have good direction when the loudest voices are really bad.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's kind of the overarching, and that was, I think, the central theme, because I wrote basically, Toxic Maturity is split into 9 chapters, kind of about the general, like the biggest areas that I thought were like target-rich environments of there is a lot going wrong here and we need to analyze why things are going wrong. And the most interesting chapter I wrote was about male role models and about fathers and about models inside of the culture. And I was very disturbed. This was kind of happening on the heels of the kind of the removal of Confederate monuments in the South and the removal of the, like, kind of like the we need to take this statue down or move it somewhere, or we need to kind of take this idol that we kind of had in the middle of a public square and like move it to somewhere else, and we don't need to see, you know, Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson or somebody in the town square of, I forget where this was at, but it was a big deal for a really long time. And I remember something about that deeply disturbed me, and not because I didn't think that, you know, Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee were on the wrong side of the Civil War and everything, and that's a complicated issue, but, you know, obviously not for slavery, not for, you know, obviously the Confederacy, anything like that. But what I think really kind of undercut that whole debate was a destruction of a person that should have been admired, or a person that was worth having a statue up. And what I realized about our culture and this kind of systemic attack on the virtues of masculinity is that when you want to destroy a culture of anything, whether it's a culture of masculinity, whether it's a culture of a nation, whether it's a country of a city, you take that city's heroes and you topple them, either figuratively or literally. And the way that I used this analogy to describe was, if you've seen the movie Troy before with Brad Pitt, about the Trojan War. So when they take the beach in the first part of the movie, when they first land on the beaches, they go into the temple of Apollo that's on the top of the beach, and then they basically ransack it and they kill all the priests and everything. And then Achilles is kind of, there because he wants to pursue glory. He's not fighting on behalf of the leader of the Greeks because he doesn't like him, and he doesn't like this, kind of the warmongering that he's doing there. And so his second in command comes up to him as he's kind of, looking over the beach, and he's next to this temple of Apollo, which is the patron god of the Trojans. And so the second in command looks at him and he says, sir, perhaps you shouldn't be doing this, because the sun god will get offended and Apollo is not going to look fondly upon you if you do this. And then Achilles pauses for a second, he whips out his sword and he cuts his head off, Apollo's head off of the statue. And the guy, the second in command, looks up at him in complete horror, because what Achilles said was, I don't care who your idols are. I don't care who your heroes are. I don't care who your gods are. I am here to not only take over your city, I'm here to destroy your entire civilization. And that happened, because when the Trojan War was completed, the Trojans didn't exist anymore. They got wiped off the face of the map. And what I think is so disturbing about kind of the removal of fathers, the removal of community leaders, the attacks on, right or wrong, on priests, on pastors, on political leaders, on actors, on all of these people that are influential in the culture, is that you give young men, to your point, no point to strive towards. You give them nothing to look up to. And so then what's left, it's the immaturity, the filth, the kind of non-growth oriented things at the bottom of the structure. And it's no wonder why you have this rampant toxic immaturity spreading primarily among young men, which also explains, to your point as well, the rise of the red pill movement in that way. Because in terms of a void from everything else, I make this analogy about Andrew Tate inside of the book as well, where, a lot of people are confused by the rise of Andrew Tate, but I'm not confused by the rise of Andrew Tate at all. And I really don't think anyone who's really, paying attention to this problem should be either, because I kind of make it as kind of an interesting point with a guy who I really look up to quite a bit in Dr. Jordan Peterson. With Dr. Peterson, his message is very simple. Take responsibility for your life, go out and get a job and marry a girl and do all these things and really take responsibility and go out there and make something of yourself. And in a way, Andrew Tate's message is not all that different from Jordan Peterson's. The packaging is different, but he basically says, get yourself in great shape, start making some money, go out and make something of yourself, go out and you train physically at something, get yourself in better shape. And so, but the image or the difference really for a lot of the young men is the packaging. Because I love Dr. Peterson, but I'm kind of an interesting person because I've written 3 books before I've been 27 years old. And a lot of guys are just kind of, they're on the internet, they're on TikTok, and they see Dr. Peterson talking in a 3-piece suit and using big words and talking about Nietzsche and things like that. And I love that, and that's awesome. But then they see this guy, former 4-time world champion kickboxer, Cobra tattoo, ripped, jacked, smoking a cigar on a yacht with models, or on a yacht with models, and they're like, yes, I want to be that. And so the problem with the hero vacuum and the idol vacuum is that we've had these corrupt actors like Andrew Tate come in and take that mantle for better or for worse. And I think for worse for a lot of young men. And so that's the issue that I think that the removal of those masculine role models and that kind of rite of passage of being a man and being taught to be a man, that's the harm that it's caused in my estimation.
So that's really interesting. And we're both Christians. We actually go to the same church.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you could flesh out, or if you did in your book, Jesus as a male role model. Because when you look at Jesus as a male role model, it's actually very bizarre. Yeah. Every male role model in human history, going back to Gilgamesh, Achilles, today, Andrew Tate, you conquer your enemies and you have a bunch of sex. That's what you're supposed to do as a man. Yeah. And Jesus doesn't have any sex, and he lets himself be conquered and forgives his enemies. So in terms of a male role model, this is really counterintuitive and really bizarre. And I'm wondering what you think of that.
Well, it's so funny you mentioned this. So Ryan, how we got introduced was that your brother is in my small group, and so we got introduced through there. So love Austin, by the way, so shout out to Austin if he's listening to this. But we got into a really interesting discussion in our small group that I lead earlier this year around when Dune came out, when the second Dune movie came out. And so I love the Dune movies, and I thought the second one was awesome. I've watched it so many times over and over again, and so I thought it was a great movie. But what's interesting is that one of the Christian thought leaders I look up to quite a lot is a guy named Owen Strand, who's written a lot of books on biblical masculinity. He's a pastor, and he runs the James Dobson Culture Institute out in Louisville, Kentucky. So he's a very big known in the evangelical Christian circles. And he was having a conversation on his podcast, takes over the entire galaxy or whatever and things like that. And so what they framed it as is that Paul Atreides in the Dune series is almost an antichrist figure in a way, not meaning that he's like demonic or devilish in that type of a way, but let's just say, for example, let's use the Christian example. Jesus rides into his final days into the Jewish, basically the capital. He's a carpenter, he's a virgin, he's not married, and he rides in on a donkey inside of the town and lets himself be humiliated, be thrown on, be crucified in front of people, mistrialed, spit on in the street, beaten, whipped, flogged, all those things. And then he dies for the sins of the people who are really messed up, which is all of us, as he is the perfect person, the only perfect person. And we are the messed up people, so all of our sins get thrown onto him, and then he dies and sacrifices himself. And what Dune says, and what Dune would be if Paul Atreides was in Jesus' shoes, is that if he rode in to the Roman capital on a white horse with an army behind him, ransacked the entire city, beheaded the Caesar, put his head on a pike, and said, I'm the captain now, basically. And so it's the complete opposite narrative to your point. And I thought that was so fascinating because it shows the uniqueness and the resonance, I think, of the Christian mythology, which I believe is reality. I know you believe is reality as well, but it's kind of this mythical, epic sort of like anti everything that we think about in our traditional heroes. And with the we've seen in traditional heroes of the rise of like anti-heroism and media and things like that, but it's just very, very different. And Jesus is the ultimate role model in almost every way you can imagine. And I think that it's kind of interesting. It's almost an attack on Christianity when you phrase it that way, when you kind of have all these alternatives that say, hey, don't do anything that Jesus guy did and just do become a top G and drive a Lamborghini and smoke cigars. It's very, very interesting, I think. So that's a great point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I walked away from my faith for about 15 years and just came back to Christianity a little over 2 years ago. And I mean, there was a number of things that pushed me in that direction, but one of them was just how bizarre this story is and how irrational by human standards. I think like no one would have made this up. If you look at the story of Achilles or Gilgamesh, that definitely seems like something a dude would have made up.
It would have grossed like $2 at the box office.
Yeah, it would have been a horrible selling story, absolutely. Yes. And I remember, I don't know if you remember this, it was probably 2 months ago in our church, one of the pastors was talking about, the story of Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus with a kiss. And about an hour before that, Jesus was on his hands and knees washing Judas's feet. And it's just like, what an absolute Chad move, just completely counterintuitive by any traditional male standard.
Yeah, no, and I think that, the one thing that Jesus did, I think more than anything else, was that he constantly, I was just watching a sermon by Mark Driscoll earlier on this morning that I thought, and this kind of resonated with me throughout the entire thing, was that he's wrapping up a series on Jesus' miracles right now, and he does 33 recorded miracles inside of the Bible around 4 central topics. And today he finished up the series with the raising of the dead with Lazarus and Jairus' daughter and the other gentleman that I forget, or the other person inside of the Bible that I forget right now, so I apologize. But essentially, there's a point, I believe, when it's with Jairus' daughter, where he heals Jairus' daughter and brings her back from the dead. His daughter had just died, and he brings her back from the dead. And he kind of goes as an aside to one of the disciples and says, like, hey, like don't tell anybody about this, by the way, please. No big deal. Like, I'm just going to walk away and do whatever. And they're like, dude, you just brought a little girl back from the dead. Like, we're going to tell everybody about this, by the way. It made it into the Gospels, and it's going to be inside of there. And so I think really the overwhelming themes that I think of with Jesus are really twofold. The first is compassion. That's the overwhelming emotion that Jesus feels throughout the Gospels, and the one recorded the most is that Jesus felt compassion for people. And the second one is humility. Like, to your point, he gets on a dirt floor and gets on a stone basin in front of him with a rag and washes his disciples' feet an hour before this guy goes and betrays him for what I believe the modern equivalent would be something like $300. And he goes and he betrays him for this small amount of money. And he kills, or allows to kill, the Savior of the world. And that is just something that it's unfathomable to comprehend because, and again, when Pastor Mark talked about this as well, where, Jesus does not have to go to this young girl to raise her from the dead. He can just he's God. He can snap his fingers and do it whenever he wants to. But he goes there to show compassion and to show humility and to identify with people and to kind of reconcile that with people and to be with people. And it's just so like, to your point, like about that being a Chad move, the ultimate Chad move would be like everyone's like I'm just going to boom, 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 this, that, like, you get a healing, this, that, like Oprah style. But he doesn't. And he goes there and he really puts himself in the mix of everything, in the mix of culture, in the mix of everything that he does. And that's, I think, why it just everything he does really just is so antithetical to what we've built up these heroes and narrative and story and myth and film all to be. And I think that's why a lot of people resonate, to your point, with what you just said about, I don't understand why this guy even did any of this stuff, so he must be saying something that's true.
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting. So tell me this, if you're a younger man and, maybe the radical feminist view doesn't sound the most appealing, but it might help you fit in, and then you've got this kind of appeal of Andrew Tate, I'm going to be an alpha male and grab it all for myself. On the surface level, this appeal of Jesus as a male role model doesn't sound that appealing. I'm going to live and die as a virgin. I'm not going to accumulate any world power. You know what I mean? How would you frame that to younger men to say this is a desirable vision of how to live your life?
Well, I mean, from a practical perspective, you can look at all the people inside of the culture now, whether it's someone like Tate or anything else. The reality is, throughout world history, name me a person that's more influential and more famous than Jesus Christ. I mean, there's none. There's no one that even comes close. And there's other religious figures that are important to a lot of different cultures, but there is no one inside of any major religious text, anything inside of the world that has affected the world more, has caused more warfare, has caused more prosperity, more destruction, more value systems than Jesus. And so what I would say is that play the long game and think about what really resonates more. Some guy on a yacht, pouring tequila in the mouths of a bunch of like OnlyFans models, or Jesus Christ. Like, it's Jesus Christ. Like, not even gonna, that's not even an argument in my opinion. And what I would say is that, Jesus said in the Bible, you judge a tree by its fruits, not its roots. And in terms of the fruits of Jesus, and we have the fruits of the Spirit that are, articulated inside of the Bible as well. But in terms of the fruit of what Jesus did, the overwhelming display of Christianity is overwhelmingly positive. Like, how many people's lives have been made better by following in the example of Jesus? And it's billions of people across time, billions of people across the world. You've been open about sharing your testimony. I've been open about sharing mine. And I think that it is a hard sell because there's no sex appeal there. But I always say that if you can, I was talking about this on a coaching call yesterday where, we were a Chili's family growing up. Chili's was our restaurant of choice. And so whenever we would go to Chili's, there was always usually one person that got the fajitas that came out of the kitchen, and they were popping and sizzling and stuff, and everyone was like, oh my gosh, the fajitas going out, whatever. But then when the waitress or waiter, when they set the plate down, it's just steak and peppers. That's all it is. It's steak and peppers. And then you get a guy that has a steak right next to him, and you're like, yeah, I'd probably rather have the steak than have the steak than the small shavings of steak and peppers. So what I would say is I would rather choose the steak than the sizzle. And I think that's true with almost everything else. Like, obviously a monogamous marriage, when you're presenting it in terms of all the things that are involved with a monogamous marriage, that is not going to be as sexy as, oh, I'm going to be, this guy who has his choice of women, and I'm going to, basically wear myself out trying to have a Rolodex of all these girls because I have money and I have power and all these things. But at the end of the day, it's not as fulfilling. And I just think that the substance of the narrative is where things need to be found. It's the plot. It's not the poster.
That's really interesting. So the Andrew Tate vision of the world is all smoke and mirrors. It's a mirage. And I think the data really bear that out. If you look at who are the happiest people in society, it's married people with children, people living, monogamous traditional family lives. And you get sold this vision that is just an illusion. It's one of those, I would compare it to drug addiction, where in the short term it could make you really happy, but it's completely hollow and empty over the long term.
Well, Scott Galloway makes a really interesting point about, and it's not about this specifically, but it's about career. And he says, like, look, if you don't have a chance of being in the top 1% of something, I would highly recommend going somewhere else with your career. Like, and so, for example, like Actor, bad idea for most people. Writer, bad idea for most people. Model, bad idea for most people. Race car driver, bad idea for most people. And so and this is, I think, at the fault of our self-improvement and hustle culture people, which I'm working to kind of maybe counteract with my companies. The sin of these people is they have kind of normalized a very extreme version of success. And they said, everyone can have this if you want to. You can be a top G2. You can be a guy that's in, Miami with 10 half-naked women around you as you're doing a podcast for hours. And the reality is that when most men enter inside of the red pill manosphere kind of cult environment that they've created and they've curated, most of them do not reach the status of Andrew Tate or anything close to that. Most of them don't. Most of them are grifters on a Reddit forum who got sold a false bill of goods that is not as accessible, that's not as successful, and it's not as fulfilling as they thought it was going to be. And they eventually go all the way down the rabbit hole, and then they're screwed. And they don't know that they're screwing themselves in the process, but they get lied to by all of these people, to your point, the influencer class of this group. And this isn't just the red pill, by the way. This is, I'm sure this is feminism as well. This is all these type of false, flashy movements that are inside of our world today. But they get sucked down this manosphere rabbit hole, and they get all of the costs and none of the benefits.
That's a great point. I think one of my criticisms of the red pill, manosphere, incel, that cluster of groups, it's the same as a criticism of wokeness, and that is it's so disempowering.
Yes.
You have this drumbeat of the message that the world is out to get me, the world is against me, I'm a victim, so I might as well give up.
Yeah, yep.
I think if you were to try to plot a way to sabotage people's mental health, you probably couldn't come up with a better vision.
Gosh, no. Oh, gosh, no. I think that there is, it's funny because all of these groups, it's almost like the extreme left and the extreme right, they always they horseshoe into the middle. I was listening to a podcast this morning. Andrew Clavin was talking about something, and he talked about this issue. And he said, and it's, because I've heard the analogy before that, kind of red pill is the male equivalent of feminism. And he said that it's kind of like that, but it's also kind of not like that, because he said the red pill guys are even worse. He said the red pill guys are a product of radical. They're not the equivalent of radical feminism. And I said, oh my God, that is so right. That is so right. And so not only are you putting yourself at a bad position with the majority of women who are probably at least somewhat virtuous and don't actively hate men, you are putting yourself as a subservient person to the worst version of women. And like it kind of just, it's just a massive self-own at the end of the day. Like it's just not anything that anyone else did to you. You just kind of were guilty of putting yourself in a bad position, and you ended up screwing yourself in the process. And that's a tragedy as far as I'm concerned. Like there's nothing worse than that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And another thing with, these kind of radical fringe groups, like Red Pill, they've centered their identity on their lack of cultural institutional power.
Yeah.
So if they got any power, they would completely lose their identity.
Yeah.
And I feel like in the same way with, you look at wokeness with critical theory, postmodernism, so long they position themselves, we are the victims, we are the disempowered, we are the marginalized, and now they have tremendous institutional power, and they have kind of lost that coherent identity.
Yeah, and it's all drowned out inside of the noise. It's all kind of, I call it shouting in the void all the time, and I think now it's like the boy who cried wolf has cried wolf way too many times, and now they're all coalescing, and that leads to greater desperation, that leads to kind of more losing of the minds on TikTok and everything like that. And I think that it's all the same thing, man. Like I think like we have different names for it, and you know all of them and I know all of them, but it's all undergirded by the same mentality. It's a victimizer thing. That's why it's culturally Marxist about any of these things, that it kind of undergirds the traditional structures that have bellied the world and kind of made the world rise together, is a system of meritocracy and shared virtue and shared value systems and everything like that. And we can have our differences in the surface level in terms of myself being a Christian, someone else being Islamic, for example. But in terms of a cultural cohesion and a societal thing, there needs to be an underlying fabric of institutional ability. And if there's not, then I just don't know how any of this functions. And I think that's why the woke movement has been such a destructive force, is that it is completely just taken a knife and drawn a line through the social fabric. And that's just kind of, and it's so interesting just to kind of see how that all manifests on itself.
That's really interesting. You brought up Marxism. I don't know if you heard recently, James Lindsay had hoaxed a group of conservatives that he calls the woke right.
Yeah.
He had rewritten a piece of the Communist Manifesto as though it were kind of Christian nationalism. And the fascinating thing was all these supposed conservatives were coming out talking about actually Marx was, right on a lot of things. And the kind of what I'm coming away with is the toolkit of Marxism, critical theory, postmodernism, what have you. Those tools don't stay in anybody's toolbox, right? Anybody can use them. So some right winger can pick up this oppressor-oppressed narrative and apply that to their vision as well. Yeah. And that's kind of scary that these tools are becoming more prolific in society.
Yeah, it is. It very much is. And I think I was pretty open with you in terms of where my political ideology stands. I grew up like Donald Trump was running for president when I was a senior in high school back in 2015. I've always really had a really strong affinity for Donald Trump. That's only increased over time. And so I'm not more of the, the traditional kind of, run-of-the-mill conservative type. I'm much more, I grew up in the Trump era. I consider myself a Trump era conservative. And one of the criticisms I have of that Trumpian brand of the right, which is now I believe the dominant strain of the right, is that if we are not careful, we can fall into the same trap that kind of the Bernie Sanders left did, which is why I think that's partially imploding in that way, where it's like, we're going into this narrative of it becomes not only a populist movement, it becomes like a populist and we need to burn everything down at the stake type movement. And I'm like, okay, we can't do that because then we're emulating everything that we're doing inside of that. And so I think what you're articulating is a really important point, because the woke ideology, it can move the goalposts in terms of where it comes from. And I think the Christian nationalist guys really fall into this quite well. I think they're probably the best example of someone who would be considered like the woke right in that way, where it's like, they hate Jews, they hate blacks, they hate, this group of people, they hate whatever, because it's going against like this, and they throw out all these blanket terms like we have systemic racism and equity and all these things on the left. And then they say these things like post-war consensus and the Groypers and things like it's like all these weird, like it's the exact same playbook but just a different set of ideologies.
It is so bizarre, like this whole post-war consensus thing, neoliberalism. I mean, they're talking like Chomsky, Noam Chomsky from. I mean, this is how he's been talking for 50 years, and now the right wingers are talking like that.
Yeah.
It's just so weird to watch this, generally speaking, socialist critique of America come out of the mouths of people who call themselves conservative.
I know. It's very strange, dude. And I think that like I got hit in the face with this the other day. So there's this guy, he got drawn to my page by one of my ads, I think, and you've probably seen a bunch of these. You'll probably find this pretty funny. He was critical of my writing. I wrote a piece after the Trump assassination about a lot of things, and he said a lot of things to me in a personal conversation I won't relay, but they were kind of disturbing. And so then he randomly slides into my DMs again. He doesn't follow me. He just kind of creeps on my stories and kind of was like weirdly kind of like stalking my profile from afar. Like he wouldn't follow me. He was just kind of like, he'd pop in and see my stories for a while, which I'm like, okay, that's fine. Like, no worries about it. But then he DMs me this video earlier this week, and it's basically, he's like, hey, like innocently he honeypots me, and he basically says like, hey Sam, I wonder what you think about this video. And he sends over this video, and it's a video of like I think that it was like a bed, and he sets like a grain of rice down on a bed, and he says like, this is like, imagine this is $200,000. This is the average net worth of a household inside of America. And he said, imagine that this is 5 grains of rice, and this is $1 million. This is the top 1% inside of America. And this is Vivek Ramaswamy, and it's a bunch of rice. And he's like, this is like 50,000 of these, net worths in one type of person. And then he goes to, and then he says like, and they think that by taking away these immigrants and everything and doing mass deportations and stuff, that they will elude Elon Musk. And there's a big pile of rice in there for like Elon Musk's $400 billion net worth or something. And he's like, well, and I said, what was the point of you sending me this video? He's like, oh, I want to know your thoughts about this. And then, I said,
you already know the thoughts.
And I'm like, I told him, I said, I think this is ridiculous. I think this is a completely incoherent argument. I didn't even know what the argument is trying to make. And then we eventually got to a point where he said, the economic system is rigged and, everything else. And I could have hit back and said like, and I could have gone into the trap and I said, no, like I believe in capitalism. I believe in markets. I believe there are things wrong with the American economy in terms of some institutions not being honest actors and things like that. But, to say that, the problem with America is Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy and Donald Trump in terms of their economic power, that's just a complete misnomer. And he said, and then he eventually said like, well, you just wish special needs kids would die. And I said, okay, that's fine. And then, okay. And then, I'm just going to go ahead and block you now and that'll be fine. And then we got to that point because I said, he's like, and because I said, like, look, I have a special needs sister and an autistic sister, and the government doesn't do anything to help those people, by the way. Like, they don't do anything. And because basically he said, like, well, the government needs to do more programs. I'm like, dude, we don't need more government programs for special needs families. Trust me, they don't do shit to help us anyway. And so he's like, well, what would you suggest? And I said, if you're a man especially, go out, work 2 jobs, work 3 jobs, do what my parents did, provide for your family. And what I said was that, if your child, your special needs child, suffers because you are too lazy to get off your ass and get a job and provide for them and to work to provide for them, then all their suffering is your fault because they're dependent on you. And that's where he said, oh, you want special needs kids to die because the government won't help them. And I said, okay, we're not having a productive conversation anymore. You're an unsuccessful person. You're a miserable person, clearly, that doesn't really have much going on inside of their life. I'm going to let you be in your misery, and I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. But the interesting part of that, where I was nervous about how much I got sucked into that conversation and how, kind of I could have hit back with a lot of other things that were kind of playing into that game. And I'm like, we got to be real careful here as conservatives in this modern era to not get sucked into that really, toilet bowl of kind of going down that cesspool of saying, well, the economy is not this way or this or capitalism or human rights or whatever. It's like, no. We need to keep an articulated vision that's better than the woke narrative instead of applying our own woke narrative to our own individual way of going about things.
That is such a good point. It's so hard to engage with bad faith narratives, bad faith arguments, because that feels like most of the arguments. Yeah. I was explaining to somebody the other day, this is true of economics, race, gender, sexuality, pretty much every topic. But if you're talking about, say, how to reduce poverty, somebody will say, well, I think we should have this government program. And I say, I think we should do it this way. And they say, well, why do you hate poor people?
Right. Yeah.
It seems so difficult to look at another person and say, I think you are an intellectually capable person. I think you have good motives. I think we fundamentally want the same things, but we're going about it different ways. It's so hard to concede that.
Yeah, and I didn't say anything and I'm not, by the way, not all against government programs. Like, if government programs can work, then fine, let's talk about those. But, I think that, but then they take what the woke people do is they automatically take your argument and they ramp the volume up to 11. And they say, okay, you kind of are on the opposite side of this, so I'm going to assume that you just want poor autistic kids to be in the street. Like, I remember, there was this other argument I got into. It was the worst argument I've ever had. I've never had this much hatred spewed at me in an argument before. It was that one of my former best friend's current wife, I actually believe, I haven't kept up with them in a while, but current wife, and it was right after, so I moved to Boston in the middle of 2020, and I remember, she got really upset at me and used her boyfriend as a hammer by saying, like, you want Jim Crow to be back in the United States because you hate black people, because you support Trump. And I said, no, I don't, but that's, fine, whatever. And then she was so unhappy that she basically said, like, she came at me a year later and said, well, I finally want to respond to your, critiques of the way that the George Floyd thing was handled, when I really didn't say much about the George Floyd thing at all. And actually, I remember I reached out to all of my friends of color, all my black friends, all my, my Middle Eastern friends. One of my best friends from college is a Palestinian guy. We have very different views on Israel and Palestine and things like that. Or actually, I don't really know where we fall, but definitely he's more of a liberal guy. I'm more of a conservative guy. So I think we have a lot of clashes kind of about a lot of things, but we're able to talk about those things. And his family literally lives in Gaza, and we're able to have a similar conversation about what's going on there. But this woman went at me in so many, like, you want black babies to die in the street, you want, us to be rounded up and shot, like a bunch of, very, and I'm like, I don't know where you're getting this from, but, like, I'm sorry that this thing is affecting you in such a way where you have to assume that I'm a terrible person, but, that's fine. And I think that's the point where any rational actors on both the right or the left, we need to say, we're not the crazy people, and we need to kind of do our best to snuff out those people, not in a literal way, but kind of just shut them out of the conversation, lower the volume on those people so we can have a rational debate and a discussion about how to do things. And so, that's, I think, the only way to go about something, because I need to get what my big error has been is I've gotten sucked into way too many of these unproductive conversations, and they've taken a toll on my mental state, because then I feel like I'm a bad person, and I go after, and they kind of, can go back and exchange in their ideas as well, which just isn't helpful to anybody.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's no point in wasting time on people who are not willing to have a serious conversation, just throwing out bad faith arguments, just trying to attack you. There's no point. I think we went over your first two books. Tell me about is your third book out yet?
So it's not going to be out until June 24th of next year. 2025 is going to be the tentative release date. So I don't want to give away too much. I've said the same to anyone who's asked me before, but I'll give you the general gist of everything. The first one, Value Economics, was centered around individual identity and kind of how you can center your identity at your core of your values. The second one was about group identity. In essence, I focused on men as my group that I studied in that book. And the third one is, it's the hardest thing I've ever tried to write in my life. It's got over 1,300 citations to the back of it. I've read so many books, articles. I've paid really close attention to this problem. And it's going to be about cultural identity, American cultural identity. And what I wanted to kind of analyze this is like, what the heck has been going on for the last 10 years? Like, why is so much craziness unfolding in the last 10 years? And I think I finally found an answer as to why that problem has happened. And I put forth my best solution and answer to that question. And it's going to come from a very, I would say, different angle than a lot of people are, experiencing. Like, I'm not going to be like a Douglas Murray, for example, and go in terms of like, I'm going to talk about race, or I'm going to talk about gender, or I'm going to talk about politics, or I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to use a different angle to kind of tackle the problem, and then show how that is metastasized into the issues we see with wokeness, with kind of counter wokeness with the rise of Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders and the fall of our institutions and things like that. So it's been very, very hard to write. It's been on my mind for almost 3 years now, and it also hits very close to home because it's a personal book for me as well. Like it has the crux of that argument that I laid out earlier, is something that's very closely attached to me, to my story, to bringing up to my upbringing, to my family's upbringing. And I think that it's going to provide a really interesting lens in terms of just how destructive and cancerous all of this stuff is, and hopefully will snap us out of it to avoid us going any further.
I like that. So can you give us, we talked a lot about like what the problems are. Can you give us some solutions moving forward so that we can have some kind of a positive vision, some kind of optimism?
Yeah. I think that, going back to Douglas Murray, basically he gave the best answer to this question when he was on Lex Fridman's show that I've ever heard, where Lex Fridman, he asked people all the time, like, what do you think the meaning of life is? And I'm not really a big fan of Lex Fridman anyway, but I remember I was listening to that show, and Douglas said, the best way to find meaning is to go where other people have found it before. And I said, well, that's the best answer I've ever heard in my entire life. Like, go back to what's worked. And what's worked has been religious structure, family, localized community, monogamous marriage, helping inside of your, like, volunteering, doing the things that provide value to yourself and everybody else. And I think with the rise of our globalized information system with social media and news networks and mass, cable companies and things like that, we have really abandoned the local for the global at the expense of the local. And so what I would say to a lot of people is, if you want, and this is why I think Dr. Peterson's overall message is right, where, Rule 6 inside of his first book that he made with 12 Rules for Life, or his second book, but his first really major marketed one with 12 Rules for Life, is get your own house in order before you criticize the world. This is the clean your room rule. If you guys remember this, when
Bucko.
Yeah, right. Yeah, clean your room, Bucko. That's what he said. So this is why clean your room is so important, was because, hey man, like, don't try to fix capitalism if you can't pick your socks up in the corner of the room. Like don't try to do that, like, please. And so I think a solution is we need to culturally incentivize the things that built people up to be good members of society. And that's a very difficult problem. And I don't claim to have an instant, like, 3-step plan on how to do this, but I think what we need to get back to are the things that have made people traditionally very happy and very settled, which is local community and emphasizing virtues like strength and morality and, having a good sense of moral fortitude and toughness and merit and earning things, and all those things that have kind of metastasized in that way, that have been simultaneously torn down in the favor of victimhood, weakness as a virtue. Just because you're a certain type of thing or a certain type of person, you get this treatment. Like, it's unsustainable if we do it that way. And that's a big portion of what my third book is going to hopefully answer, is because one of my big questions going into the third book was, okay, how far does this go? Like, what is after all of this? Like, what's going to be the next phase of the quote-unquote woke movement that's moving through our culture? And that's what I lead into the book with, And that's a very, very scary answer. If we do not get that right, that's a very, very scary answer. And I think we're getting over to that point quicker than we would like to. And so I think for a solution is just like, look at go back, like we started our discussion talking about heroes. Look at what the heroes in your life do. One of my favorite Rogan moments was that he said, imagine that you're the hero and the main character in your own movie, and the movie is your life, and that movie starts right now. What would that character do? What would Luke Skywalker do? What would Frodo Baggins do? What would Lawrence of Arabia do? What would Black Panther do? What would whatever person does? What would that person do in that moment inside of your life? What would they do? And I think almost in every story that's good and every story that's worth something, they would follow something like the Joseph Campbell style, Jesus Christ style hero's journey arc. And so that is not one that can be shirked by any immutable characteristic, any victimhood narrative, because then, again, to go back to the Jesus conversation, that movie would gross approximately $2 at the box office if that happened. And if you want a good movie inside of your life, I think going with the traditional route of that hero's journey, virtuous climb uphill is the best way to go about it.
That's a lot of good stuff that you just gave me. One thing I wanted to highlight, that back to that Jordan Peterson thing about keep your own house in order before you try to change the world. Is it just me, or it seems like people who have life figured out more than others, who have their stuff together, who have accomplished things, who are, have really thought through stuff, who are genuine intellectuals, it seems like those people, you ask them stuff on society, culture, politics, and the answers you get a lot of times are, it depends, I don't know, it's complicated, there's a lot to that. But you ask people who don't have their life together at all, and they have an exact vision or how society needs to work and how everyone else needs to act. There's it's kind of a weird dichotomy there.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very important point, and one that I think is really interesting, just because Tim Dillon, who's my favorite comedian, he was talking with Dan Soder on his podcast about a year ago, I think, and he said, I think we're getting back to the 1980s in terms of the way that our culture is going. And I think what I think he means by that is that the kind of revenge of the nerds, the fringe becoming normalized era is ending, and people are going to get stuffed in lockers again and get swirlies in the bathroom again. I think the biggest, honestly, canary in the coal mine of this is the Trump administration when they take office again in 2025. Like everyone who has worked, with the exception of Trump himself, probably, everyone is hot, everyone is fit, everyone is rapidly successful in some way or everything else. And then you have these, lack of better terms, some of the people who worked in the Biden administration and the people that like Tim Walz is kind of a freak, and Doug Emhoff is like a philanderer and he beats women in public, and you have all these weird people that are inside, like the non-binary flight executive that stole luggage. It's like you have all these, you've had this kind of slow, casual creep of weirdness that kind of comes in, and it's just hilarious irony that the defining Tim Walz moment of the campaign was the J.D. Vance's weird moment, because that was a moment of sheer, outright projection on what they were trying to bring in. They are the weird people, and it's not just the Democrats. It's this whole movement, this mindset. The Christian Nationalist guys are weird. They're dorks. They're clowns. And so, I think that what needs to happen is that those people, to your point, that follow in the Dr. Peterson example, they have to start speaking up. And they have to say, you know what, my way of living is pretty awesome, actually. And here's another narrative that we can use to build that. And instead of, again, these fringe, weirdo, freaky people that live these bizarre alternative lifestyles having the dominant force in the cultural conversation, why doesn't someone who really has their life together and is not a bad person at all, but they've worked really hard, they have a great job, they have a great family, they have a great marriage, they make good money, they volunteer at their local synagogue or whatever, they do all these things. Why doesn't that person get a say in saying what a good life is and what's going to fix society? Because they know the answer, to your point. And we need more of those people to stick up and stand up and say, you know what, the Filipino non-binary lesbian dance theorist person, you actually don't have as powerful of a voice as you would like to have, because I'm actually successful in life and I'm good at what I do, and so therefore I would like to have a voice in this conversation. I guarantee my answer is better than yours.
Yeah, that's great. There's been a preference in recent years like a preference towards transgressing social norms and traditional norms.
Yep.
So you have drag queen story hour and stuff like that where it's praised and lauded for a grown man who's hypersexualized in their dress to be twerking on a 5-year-old. That's, somehow that's praiseworthy.
Yeah.
But then if you're part of a monogamous marriage and have a nuclear family and just work a 9 to 5, things like that, it's so vanilla.
Yeah.
There's almost something bad about it, as though.
There's.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was done.
No, so basically, like, there's Kelly was talking to Dr. Leonard Sachs about this on her show the other day, and I forget the term that they used for this, but Leonard Sachs, who's I believe is a child physician, and he's written a bunch of books on how to raise children and what's going wrong in terms of how children are being brought up and things like that. And they had this phobia that was used for young children and teenagers, describing a fear of normalcy. And it's, and that's what it is, to your point. And I mean, I can't think of anything more catastrophic than that being mainstream, because if that is mainstream, then, we have no choice but the fringe, and the fringe is clearly not working. So, and that's kind of what I kind of explore in this upcoming book as well, is that when that fringe goes too far and starts to dominate everything else, the trickle-down effect of that is far worse than a lot of people would anticipate, I think.
In my marriage and family counseling class, we had to read this book called The Ethical Slut. And the theme of the book, and this was backed up by the professor in the class, is essentially that polyamory is a higher form of how to have a relationship. And if you're still stuck in monogamy, you're kind of married to these outdated, puritanical, backwards norms, you haven't kind of grown up and evolved into polyamory. To kind of your point, the way it's framed in culture is you're supposed to kind of grow up out of these Christian norms or out of these traditional norms. You're supposed to kind of grow up and evolve and become a higher person by transgressing and going to drag queen story hour or what have you.
Yeah, it's just not true, because the fundamental math doesn't work, because it's going, what that incentivizes is you actually devolving and going back to a childlike, immature version of yourself where, it's the parent that allows their kid to have ice cream for breakfast. It's like there needs to be order here. Like there cannot be, this is what, we've seen this in the evolution of Disney films. We've seen this in, all of our thing where it's like everyone gets to determine their own individual reality, their own individual way of living, and no one has to adopt a shared set of values or norms. And that is catastrophic. It's absolutely catastrophic, because we have no unifying narrative, and what happens when narratives clash is that fighting happens, and war happens, and death happens. And, going back, I mean, the Crusades proved this. I mean, this is kind of what the whole, sphere of the Middle East proved this with the global war on terror. I mean, that whole thing was like a clash of values and narratives about the way that you see the world. And if you don't see the world properly with your own next door neighbor who happens to vote different than you, or has a different hair color than you, or has different skin color than you, then what's to stop them from getting into a fist fight with their neighbor every single day? Because they're fighting for what they believe their identity is based in. And using that logic, they have no incentive not to do so.
Yeah, I like that. So I want to pivot here a little bit and talk about your business. You have 2 businesses, is that right?
I technically have 3, but I have 2 companies that I operate now. The one's just kind of a holding company for my media, so like my revenue from my Substack and my books flows through there. But then I have another one that basically is kind of an outgrowth of Value Economics, the book, which is basically Value Economics Academy, which is my alternative education platform, and then the Value Economics Entrepreneur, which is my business accelerator that I run.
Very cool. Can you tell us a little bit about those and what you do there and what that looks like?
Yes. So the first one with Value Economics Academy is essentially an actionable component of the book Value Economics, where people have basically used this program to create a set of values, create a set of identity, or an identity for themselves. And then we use that to work together in a cohort model to achieve the biggest goal or tackle the biggest obstacle in their current life, and basically retrograde and refit their life based on a value-driven lifestyle. And what that's led to for a lot of guys, we've had guys get engaged, we've had guys quit porn, we've had guys start businesses, start podcasts, completely reorient their lives, throw bad food out of their pantries, 4.0 GPAs, Tesla internships, a bunch of different things. That's been really awesome. And then the Value Economics Entrepreneur is taking that one step further and saying, I believe that the best way to get values back into the culture is by the marketplace and through the marketplace. And so we've seen kind of an inverse of this. This is kind of how Vivek Ramaswamy rose to fame with kind of his Woke Inc. book and everything surrounding the ideological capture of corporate America, things like that. I left corporate America because I was witch hunted by HR for 2 years and didn't share any of the values of my employer, didn't want to be any of my bosses. It was really, really not a great site. And I think that creating companies run by value-driven people can really enforce a better value system onto the world in a way that provides value for their family economically, value for themselves in terms of a purpose-driven work environment, and can really allow you to live in your purpose, which I think is really, really cool.
Nice. Could you talk at all about your run-ins with HR?
I can, yes. So I would love to. I actually made a YouTube video about this, a preview for you. It's going to come out next week. And so my HR run-ins, I had one where I anonymously wrote about a coworker of mine on my old blog, don'treadthisblog.com, where I didn't name any names. I didn't say anything about this, but I talked negatively about this person and their actions because they were shit-talking my manager. Ironically, they didn't protect the manager. They went after me for talking about the person who was shitting on my manager. Coworker of mine on his team shitting on my manager down the thing, and I basically said, like, you're a coward, you're spineless, gutless, the whole thing about that. And he saw that, didn't like that, reported it to HR for me exercising my First Amendment rights, I guess, and talking about something on an internet forum, which I can do. And so I was basically thrown into an HR investigation for that. And then I got into trouble with HR as well because I got into a fight with, not a physical fight, but a mental or a verbal altercation with a guy on a Zoom call on a reps only channel. I was a sales rep at this company. And they basically, we were in a Zoom together, and this guy, he was an older sales rep guy who had 20 years of sales experience but wasn't doing well, and basically came on this call and yelled and screamed at all of my coworkers who were mostly in their young 20s just figuring out their career, like, you guys suck at sales, you need to try this, like, you're not working hard enough. And I basically said, like, dude, you suck at your job. So why are you telling my friends and my coworkers who are all doing better than you that they suck at their job? That doesn't make a lot of sense. And so we got into this pissing contest, which again I didn't help and I fed into, which I need to get better at. But then he reported me to HR for being ageist, sexist, or ageist, a bully, and a racist. And then I almost got fired over it twice. It went on for 2 years, and I got basically dragged through the mud, humiliated. They had to email all my superiors about my lack of conduct or whatever. And, that was basically the whole banana of the whole situation. And I just said, at the end of the day, like, excuse my French, but, f these people. These people. Like, I mean, I will not have my character slandered. I will not have my family's name tarnished. I will not be told that I did something wrong when I did nothing wrong. That it's just not going to happen. I'm just not going to tolerate that stuff. And then I left, and a lot of people had similar issues, unfortunately, but I think a lot of those are mine, and unfortunately I think they're all far too common.
Yeah, that's a lot. Before we close, I heard this on a podcast the other day and I want to steal it. What is something that we're not talking about that we should be talking about?
Oh boy. Okay, so maybe a little bit of, are you talking culturally right now?
Just, yeah, anything society, culture.
Okay, I think the biggest thing, this is maybe a little bit of a preview for my upcoming book as well. I think the war on merit and the war on competence is getting to a very dangerous level. And I think that's what undergirds a lot of the issues that you talk about, Ryan, is that it's not just a war on someone, a skin color group or a sexual orientation or a way of living. It's a war on the ability to be good at something. And I think that if that accelerates to a degree that I hope it doesn't, we're going to be in serious trouble. So when anyone says that people who are working hard in anything should not be ahead of where they are, that's an immediate red flag. And I think culturally we're getting to a place where that's becoming unsustainable. And I think that if we allow that to go down the road, then we're in trouble. And hopefully we won't be, but I think that's something that we are not talking about that I think deserves a lot more attention.
That is a very good answer. I've written in my book, The Woke Mind, comes out in a couple weeks, and I've read so many articles from academics about the myth of meritocracy and all that kind of stuff, trying to just make it go away as though that's some kind of construct of the West, as though, before America, nobody cared about if you were good at anything. I mean, it's just, it's bizarre and it's extremely harmful. So you're exactly right.
Yeah. Very strange. It's very strange. And I think, like, it's like, even like with the example of, like, like Achilles wasn't the best warrior in Greece because he, didn't kill all the people that he killed in it's a nonsensical argument, but I think unfortunately it's rearing its ugly head once again. So that's my answer. But I think that's something we're not talking about that we should be.
I like that answer. Well, Sam, thank you for coming on. I thought we had a great conversation. I hope we can do it again.
Awesome. Ryan, let's keep doing these, man. I love these dudes. Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it, man.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's
Cool.
all.